Hello, my name is Olivia Navigas. I am in the University of New Haven graduate education program in the hopes of becoming a high school biology teacher. So this video is being made to help navigate my resource portfolio. The unit that I will be covering will be biodiversity, and within the unit I will also cover endangered species, extinction, and invasive species. All of these relate to maintaining biodiversity. There will also be quite a bit of discussion around how human impact affects levels of biodiversity. And at the end of this unit, I will be giving my students the job of writing a letter to their school's administrators. This letter will be based on whether or not the student thinks that the school should cut down a wooded area behind the school in order to increase the size of the parking lot. The students will need to conduct research, which we will do during lab time in the classroom, as well as some online research too. My hope is that the students will use the information from all the resources I've provided in my resource portfolio to create their opinion. So let's get started looking at these resources. There are 3 different types of resources which I have found. There are some unique resources which include videos, comics, pictures, and games. And there are also web-based resources which include virtual field trips, blogs, and informative websites. And lastly, there are text-based resources which include magazine articles and case studies. For many of these different resources, I was able to determine the reading level. Some resources are geared towards students with lower reading levels, while others are meant for students that read at or above their grade reading level. For example, this article right here is at an 11.1, so this is almost exactly where my students should be reading at. But this article here is at a 7.6, so it would be geared more towards my students who have lower reading levels. And up here, this case study has a reading level of 14.1. So my students would likely need my assistance with understanding this material, but some of them may actually be reading at this level. So let's get started by looking at my text-based resources. So the first one comes from Nature Conservancy magazine. It's written by Curtis Runyon, and it's called Forever Costa Rica. So this article talks about the abundance of biodiversity around the island of Costa Rica, and this resource discusses the importance of preserving this biodiversity, and it talks about some ways in which Costa Rica has gone about doing this preservation, and I think it would be great for my students to read about. Next is an article from National Geographic, and it is called Marine Invasive Species. Now I think that this article is going to be very helpful to my students because it tells them exactly what invasive species is. It explains how these species are able to invade different ecosystems, and it also gives a brief description of how people can attempt to counter these invasive species. Okay, next. This is a case study that has to do with tigers. In this case study, the challenges that tigers face, such as loss of habitat, that's discussed here. There have also been a huge decrease in tiger populations recently, and a few options for recovering these populations are discussed. And students are able to read about the needs of these animals so that they understand how the scientists are going to go about meeting these needs. And this comes from the Integrative Zoology Journal. Next, I have an article from Time magazine, and it's called Despite Global Action, Biodiversity is Declining. This article explains how countries around the world are taking steps to help the declining levels of biodiversity. There are rainforests that are being clear-cut, there are marine ecosystems that are being overfished, and extinction rates have been increasing. So I think it's important for my students to read this and understand it, because countries are creating laws and programs to counter the problems. My last text-based resource is also from Time magazine, written by Brian Walsh, which Brian Walsh also just wrote the previous article. And this article discusses the number of endangered species around the world, and the reason for so many endangered species is due to human involvement. And this article gives students the chance to see that we've actually been responsible for many of the problems that these animals are facing. And there is also a little part about how these extinctions are hurting us more than they're helping us. Okay, moving on to the web-based resources. This is a virtual field trip to the Bahamas, and I thought that this would be helpful to my students because they may not get the chance to go to the Bahamas and witness the biodiversity and coral reefs for themselves. The narrator also discusses the reasons why coral reefs are in danger and how great of a problem this is becoming. And she also discusses some of the options to help these ecosystems. And I like this field trip because the students are able to see what we've been discussing in class. Next, there is a virtual field trip to North Carolina. I like this because my students are able to see an ecosystem that might be similar to theirs around here. And the conservation biologist in the video does a great job of explaining many of the terms that we've used in class. So I think this would be really helpful to my students. Next, this website comes from the United States Department of Agriculture, and it specifically talks about Connecticut and the invasive species in Connecticut. And it not only discusses the invasive species on land, but in marine and freshwater ecosystems as well. I like this website because the students can see that this is happening right around them, and they may not have noticed it. Next is a Preserving Biodiversity blog. I liked this blog because at the top of the page there's several hashtags like you would see on Twitter, and the students can click on them and see blogs that are specific to that topic. For example, clicking on Preserving Biodiversity, if you go down, this little green circle on the picture shows that this article talks about preserving biodiversity. So this will let every student find a topic that interests them. Next, this is another blog. It's a blog about freshwater, and there's a variety of different topics about freshwater and preserving biodiversity on this site, so the students are able to find something that may interest them. And I think that this would be helpful. Okay, now moving on to our unique resources. These are the more fun resources. This year, I have a couple games for the students to play. This is an endangered species game where the students are playing and learning at the same time. It gives them a description of why these animals are endangered. Now this next game is more of a quiz, and I think it would be helpful at the end of a unit because it really covers everything we've been discussing about biodiversity. It asks a lot of broad questions, but they are important questions that the students should really understand. And this is the last game. This is about invasive species, and the students are given a description, and then they must match the description to the invasive species. So they are also learning while playing. Next, I have a video from the National Geographic, and this video gives a visual of all the readings and activities that we've been doing in class, and I know some students understand better when they can visualize the topic, so I thought this would be helpful to them. And lastly, I have a little graph here, and it discusses, it shows human population and extinctions over time. And it's important that my students see that as human population increases, the rate of extinction also increases. So hopefully all these resources will help my students.